So, as part of our series of spotlights today on stroke research in the South East, we are chatting to Naila Demeyer today. And Naila, could you introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your area of interest and what we're here to chat about today?
Yes, I would be very happy to. So my name's Neela. I'm an associate professor at the University of Oxford. I'm a neuropsychologist, and most of my work has been around post-stroke cognition, developing some screening tools for it, and to try and understand a little bit more about the trajectories over time. You know, once a person has a stroke, what's their cognition like immediately, and then how does that change over time? Does it get better? Does it stay the same? Does it get worse? And how does that all interact, basically?
Fantastic piece of work, isn't it? What inspired you to take that focus? Because I mean, neuropsych's a massive field, isn't it? So what inspired you to kind of take that trajectory focus?
Yeah, I mean, I started out very theoretical in my PhD. I was a quite a geeky PhD student, really interested in like fancy methods, but as part of it, we also did a study with some stroke survivors. And although at that point it was more of like a very experimental type study, you know, it brought me into rehab services. I went to see people on the wards, and I think that's when I thought, oh my God, you know, there's a real world out here, you know, aside from
Yes.
my theoretical interests. And then kind of seeing what was going on and how people weren't really looking at even quite basic cognitive problems. You know, it used to be, I mean, it's been a while now, but back then it definitely was, if you can walk and you can talk, you can go home, and, you know, whatever else is whatever else, and it's not our problem. So it kind of became so obvious that there was such a gaping hole, that I thought, well, I can become much more useful by doing something much more pragmatic and much more, you know, clinically applicable than my original kind of geeky interests. I remain a little bit geeky now and again. That's probably most of us researchers have a little bit of that. But I kind of really transformed my thinking into doing research for knowledge versus doing research for something useful that can actually help people. So that kind of switch happened just by seeing people, by actually starting to see stroke survivors and go, oh, this is clearly a hole.
Yeah. Is there a particular patient that really stands in your mind? And I know I'm physio by background, and you know, my penny drop was when I was a student, and I had a patient who needed upper limb treatment, intensive upper limb treatment, and inputted to him, and that moment when his finger moved in a treatment session was like, wow, I want to do this. I really want to do this. So I just wonder if you had that kind of an experience that really engaged you and
There's definitely
inspired
been
you.
there's definitely been several, but there was one I really remember because, you know, he seemed absolutely fine. You know, you thought, you know, this person is doing so well, and then he said, you know what, I can't even go to shops, I can't pay, I can't understand how I do this, so I just kind of hand over all my money and say, take what you need.
Yeah,
And I mean, this was someone who seemed so high functioning and seemed absolutely fine. I thought, well, if this is happening to you, imagine all the people who are, you know, much worse off.
yeah,
So
yeah,
it kind of was that, yeah, he was definitely one of the ones where I thought, oh God, you know,
yeah. And
we
how
could,
vulnerable he must have been
yes,
to do that, to hand
to do
money
that
over and trust that
exactly.
other person in that interaction.
Yeah,
Yeah,
and it really made him, it was also emotional, right? So he, you know,
yeah,
he lost his confidence. He didn't really want to do that. You know, he felt like he was
yeah,
being a child again. You know, there was lots of that around it. So yeah, I think, you know, just one example, but there's definitely been several others in other domains. And then you kind of start seeing, oh, it's, you know, because my PhD was on numbers, so, you know, that was like a number issue, but there's so many other issues, and you just see them. And I think it takes a bit of a leap because, you know, I'm obviously not an expert in every little bit of cognition, because, you know, you have professors who devote their whole life to understanding just one small aspect of one specific memory type, you know. And so obviously, you know, there's in every domain there's people who know more, but you kind of have to at one point say, well, actually, I do know quite a lot that
yeah.
is broadly applicable to all of these domains, and so we can definitely use some of that. But you know, yeah, there was a little step of going, well, do I know enough? And then I thought, well, yeah, I probably do actually know enough. Not an expert in everything, but yeah. And I think that's the bit that was maybe the hardest, to kind of say, well, okay, I'm going to step back and become broader again. When you've spent, as you go into academia, you become more and more and more and more narrow into this very, very small specialist area. And so, I had to really step back out again and become much broader again, which I found really interesting and nice.
Yeah.
That was a step.
And your work has been focused largely around developing and testing the OX, hasn't it? So the Oxford Cognitive Screen, yes, and the OX Plus. Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Can you tell us about that work?
Yeah, so we developed the Oxford Cognitive Screen because we thought we should do some screening for cognitive problems. And of course, things were kind of going on in random places. I'm not saying we reinvented the wheel. There was lots of things happening, but there wasn't a small, succinct screen that did a little bit of everything. Either people made their own little combinations of batteries of things that they thought would address some bit or another, or they were very focused, depending on their own interests, on just screening, say, for neglect, because, that was the thing that they cared about the most. So there wasn't really a consistent approach. So the Ox was really developed to say, let's just look at all of the domains. I mean, they were already in the NICE guidelines, say you must look at cognition, including attention and praxis and language, because it's not just memory. And I think that's one of the kind of things that we've had to explain to some people, at least, that screening for cognition is not just screening for memory, and in stroke it's screening for all of those kind of specific deficits. So that didn't really exist, and so there was some work that had gone out on before with at that time my PI, so my supervisor at that time, who developed a cognitive screen which took about an hour, because for neuropsychologists an hour of testing would be short. But still an hour was clearly not short. So we were very, very realistic by the time that we'd gone through that and understood that an hour is not short to make something that's 15 to 20 minutes, just kind of briefly assesses all of the domains, so we can look at them together, not just in isolation, not just say, okay, this patient has got, say, apraxia or no apraxia, but then what else is going on? Because usually those things don't stand on their own. So that's why we developed the Ox as a really pragmatic, short, actual screening tool to look at all of the domains, but in a brief way, and made for stroke, right? So understanding that some people will have an attentional bias and so won't be able to scan a whole page. So any tasks you have, you don't stick them in the top left little corner of a page somewhere that, people will struggle with. So it was very basic things, not rocket science, have a large enough font, keep things central, use very simple words, don't load on complex words, and allow things like pointing responses for people who have problems speaking. So it was just kind of really made specifically for what we know a lot of stroke survivors will have problems with, be that language, be that neglect. So that would not at least make them look more impaired than they are, just because it's actually not that problem that you're measuring, but a different one that seems to then, affect your results just because they can't speak very well. For example, there's a very famous study published in the Lancet showing that, after stroke, there's a higher risk of dementia after a left hemisphere than a right hemisphere stroke. But then when you look at it a little bit deeper, you see, well, it's because all the tests were requiring verbal memory. Yeah. And then, well, if it's a verbal response you're after, is that a memory problem or is that an aphasia problem? You start to really confound these things. So anyway, that was the thinking behind it. It should be fair and giving everyone a fair shot at it rather than unnecessarily penalizing them on things. That was the idea behind the Ox.
Which is fantastic, isn't it? So in terms of the Ox compared to other screening tools that are out there, what would you say about those comparisons?
Yeah, I'd say the main thing is around that kind of, this is made for stroke to allow people with stroke to do these things. And it also assesses things that in typical dementia screens are assumed to be okay. So, for example, the mini mental state or the MOCA, they will assume the patient can read, the patient can write. the patient doesn't have apraxia, the patient doesn't have a neglect because they need to fill in little boxes on the very left. So if you assume all of these things are intact, or if they are indeed intact, and you just want to test, have they got problems with kind of verbal memory, then sure, you use those tests. But if you're not sure that that's the case, you might want to just first screen, first check, do they have all of these things? Can they read? Can they write? Can they, direct their attention across a whole page before you then test their memory, if you want to do further tests of memory, for example. If your main concern is, do they have a pre-existing dementia, or were they already on a mild cognitive impairment decline? There's lots of things that may well be the purpose of your screen. And if that's the case, sure. But just think about what you're screening for is probably the
So in the perfect world, if we were thinking about how teams might be able to use the Ox, is it your vision that you'd have the Oxford Cognitive Screen as your first line screen that pretty much a lot of members of the team could do and be trained to do, so that would then inform next steps, so that you would...
Exactly. Definitely. I think it is. I mean, you've had this acute event, someone's had an acute brain injury. It is not unexpected that will knock out some parts of cognition. This is, I mean, it'd be very strange if it didn't, right? You've just had a stroke. So yeah, the idea is that in the first line event, you want to find out, what did the stroke specifically change in cognition? And that will be things like neglect, apraxia, aphasia, all of the ones that we're very familiar with. So yeah, first line screen. And if you're then still worried about dementia or ongoing decline, I think you just need to leave it a little while, because that stroke has just happened. And I would never say, you can make these diagnoses on cognitive screening post-stroke and call it post-stroke dementia if you've not seen a decline, or if you've not seen them repeatedly. So yeah, first line, definitely. And with regards about who does it, I think many people can be trained. I think a basic understanding of stroke is necessary. So I probably would say someone would need to be in a stroke team, so they understand what these kind of things are. But then, yeah, people can be trained to deliver it, as long as they have an interest in cognition and a basic level of stroke knowledge. Then, then obviously people need training. People always need training, but the idea is that it should be like first line, run first, and then there's probably two outcomes. There's saying, okay, there's all these problems, and we really want to understand what exactly is underlying it and how exactly it works. In that case, further neuropsych assessment, of course, would be very helpful. In other cases, you might say, okay, there's nothing really picked up here, but I do suspect there's something milder going on, something more subtle. Maybe they haven't got blatant neglect, but they might have like slight inattention to something, and it might not be picked up by the Ox, because it's meant as like a first broad screen. And then you might want to screen for more like subtle deficits, which is why we made the Ox Plus. That was kind of really aimed at the kind of more subtle end, especially for people, going back to work, or people, who need a bit of a heavier load, or cognitive demands are being placed on them, be that work, or be that family, or be that whatever complex situation people might be in. They might have more subtle things that you wouldn't necessarily pick up with a broad screen. So yeah, in most cases, you might need something extra after the first screening.
But the Ox Plus is better. I'm going to say better, for want of a better word, at picking up potential hidden disability.
Yeah, these kind of subtle ones for sure. Yeah, so the Ox Plus is much more sensitive. I mean, to the extent that you see, even in our healthy normative data, you see clear changes with age. So the idea behind it is that you have very age-specific cutoffs for impairment, because in a normal screen, you just want to say, okay, whatever this value, less than or more than. But when you're trying to look for subtle impairments, you can't really compare a 90-year-old with data from a 70-year-old. They will always look worse. So you really need to then make sure that you're checking against, what 90-year-olds look like, rather than what 70-year-olds look like. So you're kind of really looking for these subtle things, because healthy performance varies as well. And it may be a case of making sure you're really picking up a deficit, and you don't want to estimate the deficits either. So it's just yeah, that's a harder one, but that's what it was designed to do, and that's why we put it on a tablet, because that kind of automatic classification and calculation against norms, you don't really want to go down a long table and figuring out what kind of combination is the right cutoff. So at least when it's on a tablet, it just does it. You don't have to do that part.
Yeah. So much easier for clinical teams to kind of roll out, isn't it, in use? If teams were thinking of using the Ox, what advice would you give them about effective use interpretation, but also where could they get the training from? So
we did a very cool program when we adapted it for the Australian version. So they went all out. This was quite an interesting experience for me, because we've done other translations before, but the Australians were amazing. So this was a Department of Health for New South Wales, and they just said, we're doing this statewide. So all of the hospitals in the state are going to start using this, and we're going to implement a whole training program. And so they went big time. And so we kind of discussed and said, well, actually, could we keep that training openly available for everyone? And so that's what they've done. So there is now training. If you can find it through our website. So it's the ox-test.org website. They've basically made this kind of online training, which kind of walks you through what are the elements and how do you do it and how do you interpret it, and little bits of video and patient examples. And so it's a really nice done, because up until then, all we had done was to put a video out about how you actually do it, put some talks out from me saying this is how you interpret it. But yeah, they've now made this kind of e-learning module. So it's walks you through from the beginning. So yeah, highly recommend, and for free, so you can just sign up and check it out.
Fantastic. Yep. So our teams, it'd be great if you could send me that link in an email so that I can include it in the newsletter for the teams to have a look and explore to their heart's content. In your recent presentation to the UK Stroke Forum, when you were talking about the Ox Plus, you'd identified that 45% of patients, I think was it at the 6-month period, had got ongoing at least one cognitive impairment.
Yeah, it was long term even. So we've been following people up. So we've been running a cognitive screening program in Oxford since 2012, and so we've been following people up at 6 months. And then for the latest funding, which was by the Stroke Association's priority program, we got funding to look at long-term stroke. So we basically asked those who were still available and who were still happy to take part, because from over many years that we did have acute and 6-month data for, to see them again. And so at that point, they were at least 2 years post-stroke, but up to 9 years post-stroke. So on average, they're about 4.5 years post-stroke. So this is really long-term post-stroke. And that's where that number was. 45% still had some level of cognitive impairment just on the Ox. So not on highly sensitive Ox Plus, but just on the basic Ox. So that was quite high, higher than I thought it would be. So we ran simple things for people who know the MOCA as well, and it was about the same on a MOCA cutoff of 26, a bit less, of course, on a MOCA of 22, but that would class typically as mild cognitive impairment. It was a bit higher, even just 51% or something, but yeah, higher than you might think.
So if we were thinking about those research findings and what that might tell us in terms of service provision, needs of our stroke population, is there anything that teams could do that in terms of service design and service delivery in relation to your research findings? So were there specific domains that there was more need in, or anything like that?
Yeah, so we've got a few papers that we're writing at the moment that will come out to kind of really make that a bit more explicit and look, but I can sneak peek reveal you that the attention and memory domains were the main ones that came out. So people with early attention and early memory problems tended to keep them for longer. So whereas some other things recovered slightly better, apraxia, for example, recovered quite well. Kind of hallmark of someone still having problems long term was often if they had these kind of ongoing attention and memory problems throughout. I think in terms of service delivery design, this is a big question, and this is part of what my next big project that I'm working on now is about. What should we really be doing? Because it's all nice to say, okay, you have to screen, and then say, oh, you have to take this information and help it inform your therapy and your discharge decision, and that's all great. But then, once they're discharged, they remain with these problems, and this is when usually there isn't much left for them to go to. And so yeah, this kind of longer term follow-up, we would argue should really include some reviews of cognition, but also, and this is a little project one of my PhD students is working on, how do we talk about it with people? It's how do you discuss that? How do you explain that in a way they understand, in a way that they understand what might be coping, and in a way that the family understand, without panicking them and saying, oh, now you have dementia, now it's all downhill, because some people have been told this. And then I remember a call from a patient relative who said, well, I was told my father, so it was her dad, had dementia after his stroke, but he's been the same now for 4 years. So I'm just still waiting for this to get worse. And we had to explain, well, it's not that kind of dementia. And I think it's just about terminology. And you just have to say, well, it's probably post-stroke cognitive impairment for sure, but that doesn't necessarily mean is going to get worse. And just that kind of understanding, even for the patient themselves and for the family, is part of, and I know that's not a high level intervention, but just awareness and discussion and a bit of education is a good thing to try and implement. So we're working around some of those kind of, what should a post-stroke cognitive care pathway look like? And it's still up in the air, but definitely some monitoring and some discussion should be part of it, I think. That's the level.
Yeah, how well, I mean, this may be an unfair question to pose, but how well do you think services pull information together for patients? So when someone's had their OX screen and that, for instance, they show memory and attention deficits, how well do you think the rest of the team then factor that in when they're planning their care?
I will always say not well enough. I think there's pockets of excellent practice across the country, right? We should never forget there is always examples of fantastic practice going on, and we should celebrate them. But I think as a broad kind of saying about how is it generally done, probably definitely not well enough. And not just the kind of within service is probably okay, because there's often MDT meetings and things get discussed. But then if they go, say, from an acute setting to a different neuro rehab setting, that kind of communication doesn't always work that well. And then from neuro rehab or from acute into primary care, well, there's a lot of things to wonder about there, because a lot of that information probably will not travel across. So that's definitely also part of what we should be working on, and maybe some general education in primary care, or at least the new national model for stroke, this kind of being able to refer back into stroke specific services, would be a big help if that actually rolled out, and this was true across the country, this idea of people being able to be transferred back in. Because now, even if they go to the GP, they might send them to a memory clinic, but the memory clinic will say, oh, well, this isn't really Alzheimer's. I don't really know, especially if they then have a language problem and they can't really speak that well. They don't really know what to do either. So I think this kind of need for a stroke specific long-term follow-up service has been well evidenced, not just on the cognition front, but the cognition front should definitely be part of it.
Yeah. Our education leads for children, if you had a paediatric neuro service, they would have something called a learning support plan, where people with acquired language deficits or memory impairments would have a very clearly outlined plan of what you need to do, what strategies you need to use to support that individual to learn. Do you think we have anything to learn from that kind of approach in stroke and neuro rehab?
Yeah, I think it sounds amazing. I think that is the kind of things we might want to go for. I think the problem is still a little bit that we don't necessarily know enough about what to expect. And I think a lot of that, if you break your foot in a particular way and you want to go back to skiing, they'll be able to say, oh, well, probably unlikely given the type of break you've had. You might be able to walk again, maybe jog a bit. But when that happens after stroke, and especially around cognition, usually what you get is, ooh, it may or may not get better, and we don't really. So I think we want to work towards something like that, but in the meantime, probably we just want to support, engage, make them not feel like they've been chucked off a cliff, because that's definitely often what we hear. You know, that people feel abandoned, people feel like no one understands what's going on with them. So if we can at least address a little bit of that kind of psychological angst and a bit of openness around what this is, and in the meantime learn about trajectories and real possible, you know, with some confidence intervals around what we could say about the likely outcomes. I think that's the way forward to eventually something like a personalized plan. But it's a little way off, I'm afraid, I think.
And I guess that's where your work on trajectories is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
'Cause it's going to give us such a rich level of understanding of what happens over time, isn't it? And there's so few bits of research that do that longitudinal follow-up through patients.
There is. I think there's a little bit more longitudinal follow-up on people who've got very mild strokes. So a lot of the work in vascular dementia and these kind of, you know, there's been great work there, but they tend to be people, you know, who've got a relatively mild stroke, and then of course remain at risk for further cardiovascular events and vascular dementia. But there's a whole chunk of patients who've got much more severe cognitive problems and will still live a long life to come, and they've typically not been included in a lot of that research. So I think that's where we probably stand out, and sort of that's probably our niche. We focus on that particular group of people with kind of moderate strokes rather than the very mild ones.
And often people with impaired language and impaired cognition get excluded from research, don't they, for that reason?
They're usually not in it.
Therefore,
they're usually not in it, and so they're missing. Yeah, we're missing a lot of data on these people. That's the key bit. Yeah, to not exclude them, and work on processes for, you know, informed consent through relatives, or through, you know, we don't necessarily have to go.
Supported conversations.
Exactly.
Yeah. Fab work you're doing. If we were kind of going back a little bit to that conversation we started around hidden disabilities, what of the 45% that you found out in your long-term follow-up, how many of those had hidden? Have you got any idea of how many had hidden disabilities, or were they all far more severe than that?
No, they weren't, but so I was surprised it was as high, because people look quite good. I mean, remember, these people are already quite a selected group of people being followed up, because we've lost many people along the way. Lots of people have passed away. Lots of people were too ill to take part. So the people who are in that study are the people who were well enough, happy enough to be seen for 3 visits, quite in-depth testing. I mean, it was, you know, we tried to make it as unburdenful as possible, but nevertheless, you know, quite a bit was demanded. So you would say those are the good ones, you know, the ones that have, you know, come out really well, and still that kind of proportion. So most of those were hidden, because, you know, obviously a lot of them will have some physical problems alongside as well. So it depends on, but that part of the cognitive problems are typically, they're not so obvious.
And do you have any idea how many of those were working age, or?
Yeah, so I looked it up. So it was quite a lot, actually. So we followed up about 100 people, and there was 23 of those under 65. So if you take that as working age, so it might be, but yeah, 23 out of the 100 were under 65, and out of those, about 6 had these kind of long-term impairments, about a quarter of them. So that's still, again, more than you would probably think, because they, you know, they have had relatively good outcomes, right? They've survived very long. They're taking part in these things. It's still quite a fair.
And do you know how many of those were back at work?
I should know. A few, not many. I think there was about 3 or 4 who were back at work. Most people hadn't gone back to work. But I'll have to double check, because the majority hadn't.
Yeah. Is there anything, so with thinking again about service delivery and what your research is doing in terms of helping inform where we might need to direct service delivery and design. If we're thinking about that VOC rehab and the working age cohort of patients, is there anything that we can take from your research that teams can go away and think about and mull over and say, okay, well, it would be useful if we did this? Or
very hard, because so far most of our research hasn't really been around intervention and what is the best intervention for what. We're still just trying to understand the basic, what are the problems and how do they evolve. The only thing to say is probably that, to be mindful that there's a lot of these kind of cognitive problems, even in people who are quite young, even in people who look quite well, that might definitely prevent them from going back to work. And even just trying to understand a little bit of that, for them to understand that maybe, they need to work a little bit less, or they should just, try and go back in a reduced capacity if they can't quite cope with the amount, even though physically they could. Because I think that's often one of the things that we hear is that, it was just too much, so I gave up. So some adaptations, as we would do for other people with other disabilities, physical disabilities, you would say, oh, there need to be adaptations in place. For cognitive disabilities, often they're like, what? Adaptations? What?
yeah.
But
so
yeah.
I guess if I liken it to a physio thing, when I'm seeing a patient quite early on, if someone's severely impaired, got really dense hemiplegia, and I'm already probably thinking complete recovery is unlikely, and they've told me that their main occupation is a labourer on a building site, and therefore they need good strength, good balance, good all the rest of it, I'm already thinking that's going to be problematic. So I'd already start shaping conversations. It wouldn't be to remove hope, but shaping conversations around asking them what kind of things they need to do at work. So it's facilitating them to start thinking. Do you think there's any merit in doing similar things? So if our teams were earlier on asking for information about what job someone does and how they do it and what focuses there are? So
I imagine so, actually. So I'm just talking in a personal capacity now. It is not informed by my research, but I think so, for sure. But probably as informed by the research, you'd probably want to hold it a little bit until it's a little bit further on, because quite a lot of these things do change and do improve, and may improve completely. So you probably don't quite want to, think about until maybe 6 months down the line, and hopefully 6-month reviews will be now probably rolled out everywhere. I know it's still very much a postcode lottery. Oxfordshire has never had it, but is now finally getting 6-month reviews. Hooray. But as part of that, I think you'd probably leave the cognitive conversation for long-term stuff until a little bit later down the line, because it's so much changes. And there's also this complete information overload, right? In the acute setting, patients don't even remember everything that's been told to them, because, they just having to deal with this kind of traumatic event that's happened, and then adjusting all of the things and getting back home and just figuring out where things are at. So probably a conversation a bit later down the line, I imagine, with that regards.
I guess it's an ongoing conversation, isn't it?
Yeah.
Where you kind of information gathering to begin with, aren't you?
Yeah, a bit of monitoring and
what do
follow-up.
you do? And then and you have a little asterisk, don't you? If they've told you that they're a telecommunications person on the phone all day and they've got very little speech.
Yeah.
Then your asterisk in that saying needs urgent follow-up at 6 months and
exactly.
see how they're doing, aren't you? But
yeah, so it's more like a note to yourself initially, probably, than a very clear conversation with the patient, but definitely a note to yourself. Yeah. And hopefully to the team that then follows up, and some clear communication between the settings, if it's not the same setting. I think that remains a big problem. I think you touched upon that, and I think we hear it all the time.
Yeah. Right, fab. So does any of your research, I think you've actually already touched on this around, your research isn't really looked at service delivery, has it, in terms of intensity and dose? Is there anything on the horizon that is happening or being done, or any PhD students out there that are going to be looking at that, do you think, in terms of optimum dose for cognitive rehab? And
It's very hard with cognitive rehab is the problem. The evidence for it, unfortunately, is very weak to non-existent, even for very concrete things like neglect, which is then such a relatively well, maybe not that straightforward, but, very obvious, clear thing where several therapies have been tried. There's clear systematic reviews on it, and the evidence remains very weak for any particular thing. So for an overall cognitive rehab and all the different functions together, there isn't really strong evidence out there. But that's not to say we shouldn't persist. And I think there's different strands going on. There's these very specific rehabs for specific problems going on. There's a lot of neglect, there's a lot in aphasia. And so that's definitely one thing that we want to keep on monitoring and keep on reviewing, for things that might help. But then the general overall supportive, overall supportive cognitive rehab might not necessarily be improving the cognitive function, but it might be around finding coping strategies, finding ways to deal with it, also emotionally, because in a way, if you live with a cognitive problem and you can accept that and you can work around that and you can, that's rehab too. I mean, it's obviously not rehab in terms of recovering the function, but it's rehab and creating a happier life and good functional outcomes, which, count for as much. So I do think that there has to be a route to that, but then we need to adjust our research expectations from has cognition now improved? Yes, no, to is the patient now having a higher quality of life? Are they happier? Are they dealing with things better? And that should be a very valid outcome. And I think so far cognitive research on rehab has focused too much on is the cognition actually improving, and maybe should focus a little bit more on is the person able to cope better and are they having a good life. But that requires a bit of a shift, and maybe, I think it's starting to happen. You can see it in some studies coming out. So hopefully, fingers crossed.
And understanding that link between an impairment level measure and what the functional outcome is interesting, isn't it? I mean, we see the same in physio. You see patients who you can splint, and when you test them on a plinth or in a sit to stand situation, they've got almost nothing in their leg, but somehow by hook or by crook they can stagger about. And if you went by impairment level measures alone, you'd think they're never going to do it.
And then if you evaluate your own intervention based on how well they're doing on this particular impairment level, they're going to say, well, that physio was not very successful at all. Whereas actually, they were very successful.
Really successful.
It was hugely successful. I think we need to move towards that. I think academics, struggle with that because they like to just see, okay, we have this one function, we improve it. Is it now improved? And it's probably the same across physio as it is across psychology, this kind of very impairment level focus. But let's move away probably.
And things are rarely linear, aren't they? Sometimes if you keep the hope going and you achieve a functional leap, even if that's a heavily compensated functional leap, then the patient's own self-efficacy and motivation to continue to invest in the other bits, the building blocks to get further improvement is reinforced, isn't it? So then you see a leap and a change, and improvement often goes like that, doesn't it? For that reason,
and those definitely matters then, right? I mean, there's several studies definitely in physio and upper limb and lower limb about those being so important that there has to be enough repetition for there to be. So I'm sure it will be something similar if we go towards cognitive specific, like impairment levels. But maybe it depends what the question is.
Okay, so we touched on where the teams can go if they want to find out some information about how to learn about the OX and the OX Plus and how to get trained in it. Do you mind just repeating that information for us? So where could they go?
So we set up a website just ourselves, and it's called OCS test.org. So that will have within it information about the OX and the OX Plus. Now also the digital multiple evidence test, which is a new one that's come out from us. And so there'll be little videos there, how you can get the materials, where you can get training, etc., etc. It's all kind of encapsulated on that main web page with different little sections.
Fantastic. And are you able to give us a little snippet of where your research is going next? What do you want to do next?
So I was lucky enough to be funded by the NIHR recently. So I've just got a 5-year fellowship, which means I can just do research and I don't have to do other bits of academia for a little while, which is great. And that whole project is around the care pathway. So it's around developing in co-design with patients and clinicians what something should look like down the line, to, you know, after discharge home. What would these cognitive reviews look like? What might these communication guides look like, where you talk to the patient about their cognition and to the carers, and how do you track kind of that cognition and just simply support it? So the plan is to kind of make that hopefully workable care pathway, and then to test it out in services that are not our own. So to test it out to see, you know, is it feasible? Can it be run? Because anything we want to make, we want it to be pragmatic and deliverable. You know, you can always make the best possible care pathway, but then if no one's going to be able to deliver it, that's no use. So it would have to fall within, you know, some of the ESD services, maybe the National Plan for Stroke, you know, this ongoing longer term community service, the 6-month reviews, you know, so it has to fit within an existing pathway, or it has to be a doable extra pathway that can be implemented. And that's why we want to test it in places not our own, just to see, you know, can services actually make that. But that's the end bit after we've made it. Input's very happy to receive input. People can always email me if they want to be part of any of that co-design efforts. We've sent out a survey around just before Christmas and got over 100 replies to that one. So obviously that information is going to feed in. But yeah, we'll do some workshops with people as well. That's the next steps.
Fantastic. So if teams did want to contact you, is there a central email that they can contact?
Yeah, it can come straight to me. I will handle it.
How many people might contact you now?
Well, I hope lots of people contact me. I mean, I do get a fair few emails, probably too many a day, but you know, stuff like that is interesting and lovely to hear. So, you know, it's more interesting than some of the other academic emails we might get. So I'm happy to fill that. I might not reply immediately. I should probably also disclose, but it's happy to have them, truly.
Great. It sounds really exciting, and I'm sure the teams in the South East would be really keen to participate in what you're planning on there. So we'd love to hear an update on that and to keep in contact. Thank you so much for agreeing to chat today. It's been really interesting. It's a fabulous work you're doing, and I mean the amount of more granular understanding we've got of cognitive needs across our population, and how that needs to help direct our services and what we need to provide is just invaluable. The kind of learning that you're enabling teams to have. So it's brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and it's great chatting to you today.
You're too kind. It's been a lot of fun. So thanks so much for having me. It's been a nice, fun conversation for me to have as well. So
okay. Well, thank you for that, Neda. And I'm going to stop recording.
Okay.
Oh yeah.